Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Iker Hill, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the nonprofit organization Mass Context, which is based in Chicago. And on behalf of Mass Context, I would like to welcome you to today's conversation, which coincides with a week-long screening of our website, on our website of the film Uppland. The start of the screening coincides with the anniversary of the Liberian Declaration of Independence, which was adopted by the Liberian Constitutional Convention on July 26, 1847. We're especially happy to screen this film after having organized a talk with architect Killian Doherty in 2017 at the Chicago Architecture Foundation, where he discussed the film as a work in progress and introduced short extracts from the film. And besides that, we're also thrilled that both Killian and Sumayya have been contributors to Mass Context in previous issues. Today, we have the pleasure of launching the screening with a panel discussion including the film's director, Edward Lawrenson, architect and film producer, Killian Doherty, and architect Sumayya Vally, founder and principal of Counterspace and architecture practice based in Johannesburg. The event will be moderated by Danny Hoffman, who's the Bartley-Dobb Professor for the Study and Prevention of Violence and chair of the African Studies program in the University of Washington's Jackson School for International Studies. I will be posting their full bios on the chat feature, as well as a link to watch the film on Mass Context website. Please feel free to send any questions to the panel using the chat feature, and we will have time after the conversation to answer them. I'd like to thank Grasshopper Film for making the online screening possible, and to the panelists today for being able to join us from Seattle, Portland, London, and Johannesburg. Danny, it's all yours.
Great, Iker, thank you very much. Welcome to everybody, and it's really an honor to be asked to do this. I'm an unabashed fan of the film, and it certainly touches on, I think, some really important issues for all of us. And it's great to be with you, despite the strangeness of the format. I wish we were all doing this in person, but it is what it is. So, Killian had asked me if I would very quickly do just a little bit of a contextualizing I'm assuming that people are at least familiar with maybe the broadest brushes of Liberian history, but I thought it might be helpful just to give a kind of very quick 2-minute bit of contextualization. As Iker noted, this is Liberian Independence Day, so happy independence. The Liberian independence is actually, as Iker mentioned, is declared in 1847, which makes Liberia Africa's oldest republic. It is actually, it's the only part of West Africa that wasn't formally part of the European colonial project, right? Which is an important thing to keep in mind, and something Liberians are justifiably very proud of. And yet, I think one of the things that sort of important subtext for the film is that it's an independence that we need to be thinking critically about, right? What does that actually mean? And so I wanted to kind of put two basic contextualizing facts on the table as part of our for those who haven't seen the film yet. I think these are things to keep in mind. For those who are thinking kind of with the film, these I think are important things to bear in mind as we try to understand what the Yekepa story tells us. The first is that the time when iron ore, the Yekepa iron ore mine is being expanded is a very particular moment in Liberian history. After World War II, President Tubman, who was the long-standing president of Liberia from 1944 until 1971, if I'm not mistaken, is in this moment of the post-World War II period, he is embarking on two important projects. One is a unification project where he's very deliberately saying to the nation, we need to bring the interior of Liberia into the national fold, right? The interior of Liberia had long been regarded as a kind of blank, empty space that was outside of the reach of the capital, which is on the coast, right? So we have this project of expansion into the interior, which even from the point of view of the political class was regarded as kind of a blank slate, right? That needed to be exploited, it needed to be developed. And the corollary to that, and part of it, is that Tubman begins what's known as the open door policy, where he says that the way we're going to do this unification is we are going to essentially open the Liberian interior to international free enterprise, right? He's very closely allied, as many Liberian elites were at the time, with the US for historical reasons we can talk about. But Tubman actually said at one point that Liberia had missed out on colonialism, and so it missed out on the benefits. And so what it needed to do was it needed to make itself available. And thus we see the rise of like the rubber industry, which is a little bit older, which is what most people identify with Liberia, but also the iron ore industry, the exploitation of timber. All of this begins at a massive and very deliberate scale in the period of the late 1940s, really in the 1950s and 60s. And frequently the result of that were these kind of an enclave form of capitalism, right? Exploitation around a very intensely, mining is important, like I said, timber felling, and so you have these kind of enclaves emerging in the interior. Now, the second thing I think it's important to keep in mind as we watch the film, or as we talk about the film, is that this is a history that in many ways is being repeated today, right? We are now going back through a moment where I think many Liberians are beginning to again talk about the interior as being regarded as a blank space, right? Now, the sensibility at the moment is much more critical, right? That many Liberian elites and many foreign companies tend to regard the interior of Liberia as a farm. And you'll hear this phrase quite frequently, right? It's a blank space that just needs to be developed. Now, a lot of this development now is happening through different partners, right? Chinese corporations or Chinese government sponsored programs are coming back in to many of the old iron ore mines, trying to redevelop them. Iron ore has gone from being a fairly minimal part, a steep decline in the 80s and 90s, and is now back as I think it's 30% of Liberia's earnings are now coming from the attempts to re-exploit some of these iron ore mines. Palm oil plantations are emerging in places that had previously either been rubber plantations or forest. And again, we're getting the emergence of these towns and enclave forms of economy. So on the one hand, we talk about Liberia as an exceptional case as being outside of the colonial project, and yet in its past, it replicates many of the forms of colonialism in Africa under slightly different guises. And we also talk about this as being issues that are set in the past, and yet we're seeing them emerge in very familiar forms across the Liberian landscape today. And so I think these are important things for us to think about as we talk about, as we think about the film. So again, we're happy in the discussion, we can get a little bit more into the particulars of Liberia, but I think that hopefully these are helpful orientations for our discussion. So I've been given the honor of moderating this. So the panelists have been introduced. So maybe what I'll do is just start with throwing out some questions to get us started. And I'd really maybe we can begin with Sumayya and then with Killian. And the question I'd like to put to you all is the story that we see in the film of Yakepa in some ways just seems so extraordinary, right? We have a Swedish company coming into the Liberian interior, creating what they refer to as Little America. And it would seem so, in some ways, so unique and so particular. And yet, as I've just tried to lay out, this is actually a very familiar story in African history. So I guess I would put this to you all. What do you all see as the lessons that we need to be taking away from a film like Uppland that explores this history in a very particular place? How do we make it speak to larger issues in colonial history and in post-colonial history in Africa?
Yeah, I think, thank you so much, Danny, for the question. I think a lot of what you said resonated with me deeply when I watched the film, that this is, even though we're seeing historical footage and we're hearing anecdotal accounts, it feels really, really familiar in terms of what we're seeing that's still perpetuated in the world at the moment. I've been, in my own work, doing research about the connections between territories, between Johannesburg and mining companies here. And something interesting that I found and that I continue to quote is that 101 companies listed on the London Stock Exchange, most of them British, have mining operations in 37 sub-Saharan African countries and collectively control over $1 trillion worth of Africa's most valuable resources, which is astounding to think about, that this loop still carries on in our day-to-day lives, and that we're all really bound by the deep fault lines of control. I think that this is also very topical at the moment, and that we're seeing, how do I say, the consequences of, we're seeing in every crisis that we're going through, whether that's climate change or migration or, of course, lack of resources, that our deep past and our recent past are still playing out very much in every context in the world, and that all our territories are inextricably bound, whether we choose to recognize it or not. And that's the first thing I'll say, and then I'll come back after Killian's spoken a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. Thanks for the great intro. I suppose it's kind of worthwhile situating the kind of concept or the model of the new town kind of like historically, because we talk about it as something that is familiar, not even just to Africa, but I mean, it's familiar because it's essentially a kind of like Western utopian idea, the kind of the model village in the new town. And it's really kind of connected to sort of the kind of industrialization of the West and the urbanization of the West. And I mean, when I say historically, I mean, it's something that emerged like in the kind of 17th century England, this idea of this model village. And it was often a kind of philanthropic project of the kind of rich industrial landowning class. I mean, so it goes kind of as far back as that. And it, sort of kind of developed this sort of earliest form of socio-spatial engineering. So it's a kind of really kind of tethered to, let's say, architecture and kind of urban planning. And it's this sort of like model village idea, but kind of came more sophisticated. I mean, it sort of emerged through the kind of the Garden City model by Ebenezer Howard. And then it became something that kind of was exported, as to Africa, kind of in the colonial project in the kind of 1930s. But as it did, it was like its original kind of socialist and environmental ideals became diluted. And it's kind of just worth noting that kind of few of these projects kind of like happened is kind of why it's familiar, because I mean, I think the history of the model village in Africa and the kind of the colonization of Africa is something that kind of is relatively unknown. And there's many big name architects who we kind of admire the kind of feature in it. And so like, I mean, in 1932, it kind of started in Niger. The French had kind of like planned a settlement around irrigated kind of thousands of hectares of land for the production of cotton, raw cotton that was used in the kind of French textile industries. Then there was the kind of paysanette schemes in Belgian Congo in the kind of 1950s. I mean, you're talking about mass populations of up to 150,000. The largest and most ambitious one being the villagization projects in Tanzania, I'm sure you're familiar with, which kind of relocated between 1970 and 1973. And this is in post-colonial Tanzania, up to 5 million people, but I think kind of one of the most kind of maybe overlooked projects in kind of relation to architectural histories was the kind of Lake Volta, the damming of Lake Volta in Ghana, and which was a kind of the removal of around 100,000 fishing communities and kind of river communities around aluminum and kind of hydroelectric energy. And the new towns, a lot of the new town projects kind of emerged from that were designed, or the commissions were, the work was commissioned to the architects Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew, who are sort of like the pioneers of kind of tropical modernism. And this sort of like tropical modernism has like really informed a lot of kind of like the humanitarian architecture today, this sort of like localized, rather superficial, apolitical kind of approach. But I mean, so the kind of new town really needs to be situated within this idea of the kind of Western assembly line, and particularly the house as well, the kind of the idea of this kind of global, this kind of like the bungalow, this kind of like Western model as a kind of form of domesticating, quote unquote, the natives, and I mean, it was particularly, it was something that was spoken about in the film about the kind of the house feeling like the kind of Swedish suburb. And what was happening in Sweden at that time was the kind of like these, the expansion of the urbanization of Sweden and the growth of these new towns. And a lot of the architecture that was happening in Sweden is redolent of what was happening in Ikepa. And I suppose like what has happened in Liberia and in other kind of African countries, like similarly in Sierra Leone and even in Rwanda, is how that it's that the kind of model is still coupled to the sort of developmentalist ideal about the economic model, and now it's kind of couched and veiled within really like corporate social responsibility kind of language. I mean, ArcelorMittal, who've taken over the town, who took over the town and opened it up in 2010, have sort of renewed the old Lamco language of, you know, about, you know, developing the interior, you know, but the kind of language is so persuasive and nostalgic, and but it's really interesting to see the way they've cherry picked the town and kind of used parts of it. So I think the kind of model village in the new town, nearly as we understand it in the West, in Western architectural history, it really has an important place within African architectural history that is ignored about industrialization and urbanization. So yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you. And that, so, I mean, it's interesting that one of the things that I think both of you touched on, this is where I'd like to bring Edward in too, is the idea that there's a certain kind of necessary blindness, right, that has to go into this idea that you're coming in and mass planning, right, dropping into the middle of a place, this new organizational model, right? We're going to import the town, we're going to import the, you know, we're going to make little Sweden here that requires in some sense an erasure of what's there, right? So I think you very astutely pointed out that there is often a vocabulary of localization, right? We need to borrow local forms, and yet that often is a very facile understanding of what the local requires or what its existence. So I'd like to put this to all of you, but maybe we could start with Edward. It seems to me that in many ways there's something about the architectural interventions in colonial spaces, post-colonial spaces, maybe Africa in particular, that tends to rely on that kind of blindness, right? Which in many ways is what architects and filmmakers both, who are engaging with questions of the built environment and space, are incredibly sophisticated about thinking about the you know, questions of representation, about what local places mean. And yet often when it comes to Africa, in both film and architecture, that blindness sort of suddenly pops back up. And so I guess maybe as somebody who really had to think about this in a very particular way for the film, like what was your, what are you taking into the film, knowing that this is a pitfall in making a film about African built environments? How am I going to think about this as a filmmaker, and also then as somebody who's speaking to African architectural histories?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, that question of blindness was, you know, I think that's a very good point, and I was very, very, you know, sensitive to that. Both Killian and I, when we were going there, and I think the very last thing we wanted to do was to for the film to sort of convey this idea of sort of a kind of neutrality or objectivity of, you know, and that, and in some way the encounter, the film is hopefully kind of foregrounds the nature of the encounter between us as Western researchers in you know, an African environment. And you know, it was the first time I'd been there, you know, and I was building on and drawing and collaborating heavily with Killian's research. But so in a way, that's one of the reasons the voiceover came in. For those of you who haven't seen the film, there's a voice is a key part where you know, it signals our, I guess, our positionality, and that these, you know, and the question that we have as filmmakers, as researchers, is kind of what do these buildings mean for us? What do they mean for the users of the space, and what do they mean for the the Swedes who, who left, who've long since left. And film for me is a kind of good way of evoking these questions around images of buildings, and so really that was, I guess, our intention for the film, to kind of provoke these questions, and to give a sense of the layered and sometimes kind of contradictory meaning that the ruins and the sites of devastation provoke for different communities.
And Sumayya, maybe I could ask you to sort of speak to this as well, as somebody who is also sort of straddling the line between thinking about representation. I mean, I think what Edward said is important. Like there's a way in which, so in the film, as you said, the voiceover, one of the things I really like about the film is you actually effectively use the voiceover as a way of calling your own positionality into question, when so often the voiceover in film, and particularly in sort of films made about Africa, serves as a kind of voice of God, right? I am the objective expert and I'm going to tell you what you're seeing. And you use it in a very different way. And so I wonder, Sumayya, maybe if you could just sort of pick up that thread for thinking about, as an architectural practitioner, both who's calling on both to represent built environments in African context, but also as, direct interventions. How does that sound to you?
Yeah, I think that objectivity is very dangerous, or the how do I say, the pursuit of objectivity is a very dangerous pursuit, because it masks so much violent erasure and so much violent silencing. So I also really appreciate the positionality in the film, and I think what's really beautiful for me is how atmospheric the film feels. Also, that the kind of oral is so deeply situated, and we're almost transported through that. And I think for me, one of the most important things about representation is really absorbing a place and becoming a part of it through dialogue, intense dialogue with the place. I still believe very much in our power as architects, or in our agency as architects and as storytellers. So I'm not saying that we completely give over that position and we don't have something to say, but I think that it's very important that we do ingest a place and that we do dialogue with it and that we situate ourselves in it. And for me, that's a very important starting point for any project. It's about starting from the place, not from our own rational thought, so to speak. Because I think often as architects, and even in the education that we receive, that Killian touched on as well, in this idea of Western architectural models and so on, it is very much always about, we are taught that architecture is an act of projection, which it is. But I think the way that we are taught to see things is very much through rules and orderings and systems of rationality, golden section and so on. And I'm not saying that those things don't have a place, but what that does do sometimes is erase the actual fabric of the place that we are working with. And it also, perpetuates an othering. It perpetuates this idea that you project onto a place instead of you embody the place, or you understand something and then you work on ingesting and embodying it. And I think that the film does that really beautifully, in terms of how it does embody the place and it does convey an atmosphere, or a set of atmospheres.
Could I follow up on that with a follow-up question for all of you? Because I think, as Killian noted, historically with Fry and Drew, for example, in tropical modernism, the kind of listening to place was about listening to climactic and environmental conditions, right? It was, how do you build in the tropics? And what you're suggesting is a listening to place that's very different, right? And I think what we see in the film is a kind of, you all captured so beautifully, is a listening to place that's cultural, that's social, that's, how do we, and what happens when that doesn't happen, right? So, you know, for the three of you, as you know, is there a different kind of listening to place that you can flesh out for us a little bit? Either as you saw it, you know, where do we see that kind of materialized in the film, but also where do we see that materialized in built forms, you know, today? I realize that's a very abstract question, but I am an academic. I'm a university professor.
I mean, I will say that one thing about this idea about listening to place, and it's a very very poetic and a kind of like, you know, very beautiful way of kind of putting it, is like, how do you kind of gauge with it, or how to become embedded? And I think kind of me and Ed were, or I mean, I'd been there a few times before Ed, and so I was kind of cognizant of like how, let's say, kind of UKPA had been like most of Africa, and you know, it's a kind of constantly been intervened upon. These places have been kind of constantly intervened upon and cajoled and erased and kind of like remodeled on a kind of on somewhere else. I mean, but UKPA has been somewhere where it's kind of been intervened and then abandoned and intervened again upon again. And, you know, there was so many kind of like different actors. It was hard to kind of get a sense of exactly what was that kind of, what is the place of UKPA? And it was one of the things that we did early on, was make sure we were speaking to people who had been listening to that place, you know, and were able to speak to it for us. And it was, I mean, because when we went there originally, you know, it was, you know, some of the early ideas about the film were about the sort of, the kind of naked colonial kind of project of the Swedish, and how it could be read through the architecture. But upon going there, it was only when we'd spoken to, or had you know, a community facilitator who'd been connected through someone else who in Monrovia. Once we were put in touch with him, it's sort of, we were sort of able to listen to it, and we got in touch with, or we were connected to Lawrence, you know, the janitor who works in the evangelical school, who is the former, or he is the chief of the Mano community displaced. I mean, we weren't able to do that if we hadn't. Yeah, so you know, it wasn't necessarily our listening to the place; it was allowing the kind of ears of those who'd long been there, you know. And so, and I don't know how to go about that, but it's just, I suppose it's like, you know, the kind of like reflection, or the kind of having that cognizance, or being aware of not simply kind of coming in with a sort of determined idea, as architects often kind of tend to do, you know. It was like, how would we kind of construct that frame that wasn't simply, you know, a retelling of how we wanted to do, you know, tell UKPA, you know, because I mean, the time would lend itself to kind of like a very, a film which Edward had talked about as a type of ruin porn, you know. We didn't want it to be about that. So it was like, it was important that the kind of frame was kind of constructed in a way through the kind of eyes and ears of the people that were there, you know. And, you know, and so, yeah, so it's a kind of, I don't really know how, if I have a sort of method about how we went about that, but it was just, we were tentative and aware of it, you know, prior to going there.
I would maybe add to that sometimes listening is like not listening properly, and that there's a moment in the film where we go to New UKPA, which is the town that the Mano community built. And I mean, it's quite an absurd moment, because, you know, I'm wanting kind of one thing, I'm wanting kind of an appearance of naturalness, and then one of the villagers, you know, starts kind of directing in front of the frame. But the absurdity is hopefully our absurdity. The absurdity is the preconceptions that we went there, and the predetermined kind of idea of what we wanted. And there was an invitation to think about the practice of architecture through that filmic moment as well.
It's an incredibly, I have to say, I watched it again this morning, and it's an incredibly powerful moment in the film, because I think it does, as you said, it destabilizes the project in a really interesting and I think quite compelling way, right? And it is as you said, it's a different kind of moment of listening, which I think was well done. So this brings up a question that, again, I would put to all of you, and it's a very broad one, so it's more of an invitation to kind of play with an idea. But one of the things that's I find very striking about the film, and I guess I find as somebody who has thought about built environments in Liberia particularly, is this idea of nostalgia. Right? There's a good deal of conversation in the film about how good it was at the moment that Lamco was there in full production. It was good for the Swedes. It was good for the Liberians. And you see in the, it's clear that in fact, this is not the reality on the ground. But so nevertheless, if this kind of resource extraction and the infrastructures that support it are so common across the country, the continent, right? So many African countries are dealing with the legacy of a certain kind of built intervention, right? A certain kind of colonialism. So the future is undoubtedly one of trying to deal with the legacies and the ruins of that kind of development model, right? And I think a number of architects, I think, Killian, you referenced this earlier with the kind of corporate responsibility speak, and a lot of architectural firms are getting involved in projects that are sort of, if they're not corporate projects, they're often NGO projects or nonprofit connected projects that have certain connections to a kind of extractive industry. So how do we think about what to do with what's left, the detritus or the ruin of this kind of infrastructure, as everybody is trying to understand how do we inhabit it, right? How do we get past nostalgia? How do we think differently about how this history might be made present and important in the built environment or in development projects, without sort of, but having a very critical sensibility about the past. But Sumayya as an architect, Killian is an architect and filmmaker, Edward is a filmmaker. Like you two have to wrestle with these things. How do we take the lessons of Yakepa and sort of think about the projects we're working on next? As what do we do with that kind of future intervention?
Yeah, I think it's a very big question that every African state and beyond also is currently grappling with. And I think that it's also something that we're all being asked, what is the future of African identities and how are those being expressed in the built environment? I think that this is not a question that we can of course answer now, because we have to also contextualize that we are dealing with how do I say we're dealing with a history that was and then was kind of put to a stop and ravaged, and then this other set of things was projected onto that. So and now we're dealing with the consequences of that, but we're trying to go back to imagine something unfold that never got a chance to unfold, or multitudes of things that never were allowed to exist. So it is very, very complex and very huge, the question you're asking. But at the same time, I think that it is very important that we do take this project on, and that also we situate, I think for me, for example, it's very important that my practice is situated and working at many different speeds. The speed of the urgency of what's going on in the present, but also this kind of slow speed of working through very complex and complicated histories and deep pasts, but deep futures as well. And I think that, yeah, it's a generational project. I think we also have to ask about how our institutions operate, because those are also colonized. All of our platforms of publishing, of teaching and learning, everything that we have is kind of edited and warped, and we have to accept that. And at the same time, I think that there is so much that's exciting that's happening on the continent, and that's, for example, in Johannesburg, my biggest source of inspiration. There is so much to learn from people and the lives that they live, and belief systems and the kind of economies in the city and so on. And I think that we should be working from other places, from spaces of difference as much as possible. And I think that our perspectives as people of color, as women, as people who come from different belief systems and from different parts of the world are really, really needed at the moment in order to imagine futures that are not warped and that are not perpetuating the same kind of histories that we have. And in my context in particular, I definitely draw on other disciplines and other practices that are very spatial, and I think that lend themselves very much to different ways of looking at architecture. So in my own context, I think ideas around performance or around, as I was saying, the oral practices that are much more embodied can offer a lot to architects and to architecture. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really sort of don't, I don't want to answer the question in a way because, you know, the sort of, the urge is to kind of, as an architect, is to think about it as something that can be, you know, rendered solvable, you know, through the idea of the building. So rendering like kind of these huge social and environmental kind of questions are kind of solvable somehow, you know. And I mean, there is the whole kind of like, you know, what's going on there now with ArcelorMittal, I suppose, in terms of like kind of reactivating the town and only reactivating parts of it. You know, they're cherry picking kind of parts of the town that they want to use, you know. So the kind of model of the town has kind of become more streamlined as the kind of extractive industry kind of becomes more streamlined. You can kind of see how that's working, you know. And a lot of the residents, or the former residents there, would always talk about the loss of the vocational school, you know, the kind of vocational schools. So, I mean, there's obvious like things that could be done, but I mean, do they kind of begin to, I think they sort of just kind of perpetuate the kind of the model or the paradigm of the kind of humanitarian architect, you know. And I think what Sumayya is talking about is like these sort of deep histories and these like, you know, the kind of the exhuming and the excavation of kind of architectural practices through these other ways is one. And this thing about the kind of voice, the idea of voice and the use of voice. I mean, for me, you know, I kind of keep coming back to kind of Ikepa, or the idea of it being a kind of space, obviously, which was kind of, you know, the town was an imposition, but like how this nostalgia sort of is really sort of still quite robust and strong, both for the librarians, but both for the Swedish that we met. And I mean, it was important for, you know, I was like, you know, when we were doing this, I was saying to Edward, you know, we should go back to Sweden and try and talk to the former residents. And in a way, sort of like the film kind of became a kind of construction, and that both these voices could kind of occupy that same space. And for me, there's like so much left there to kind of, as a kind of, for me, that's a kind of project. And how do we go, if we were to go back to Ikepa, like how do the kind of the Swedish begin to kind of like re-engage with it? Like the Swedish who were even born there, this, you know, they're Swedish in their 30s or 40s who we've met. And they talk about it in very different ways than their mothers and fathers, like the generation who worked there and that worked in the mine. When they see the film, are kind of unsettled by it. But the children who were born there like have a different way of kind of seeing it. And I just think that there's something kind of interesting there. And I'm not talking about, you know, this, I don't mean to say in terms of like reparations, but there is something that about this idea of constructing a space in which these voices can begin to kind of, I don't know, yeah, is a kind of reconciliation of some sort, you know? Yeah, so that's kind of what I'm interested in, you know, like as an architect, kind of how do you construct that, you know? Whereas my urge and the kind of instincts are like, oh, there's a project in here, you know, you could do a vocational school, or you could begin to kind of map the environmental kind of change, which is useful in itself, but yeah.
Maybe just add to that, which is the times we've shown the film in Sweden, you know, to people who were intimately involved with the sort of Ukapa story, the film has either resonated positively or negatively. But I've been surprised about how little known the story of Lamco's involvement in Liberia is amongst a kind of general Swedish audience. And so if the film can do one thing on a just purely, I guess, journalistic kind of function and kind of make more Swedes aware of, you know, what happened, then, you know, it's that can help imagine a better, you know, that can a different kind of future, you know. But at the moment, I don't know what you would say about this, Killian, but the general kind of knowledge about what the Swedes were doing in Ukapa and in Liberia in the 70s and in the 60s and 70s is pretty low.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, it's like, maybe it's like the project of the Scottish and the Irish next, do you know what I mean? So, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So I know we've got some questions coming in, which so in a second I'll ask Iker to maybe give us some of the questions on the chat. I have one other question that I think is related to this that I'd like to throw out to you all, and this is entirely self-serving, so I apologize. But since a lot of my own work is on urban spaces, one of the things that I was struck by in rewatching the film, and I guess in part of our conversations, is how there's a very particular kind of important rural aspect to the Ukapa story, right? As there is to much of colonial history and the way that the post-colonial history has positioned Africa as a kind of the space of the rural, right? And in many ways, we can imagine this, you know, that paying, again, to go back to Sumayya's phrase, sort of listening to place, in a rural context is one thing. In an urban space could be very different, especially in African cities, many of which are very young, very cosmopolitan, right? You know, Monrovia is represented by people from all over Liberia. You know, many African cities have histories that are incredibly complicated, but also in some ways fairly shallow, right? They're not, you know, Joburg is a perfect example of this, a city that's in many ways a very young city. So is the kind of strategies that we think about either that we are trying to work against or that we are trying to promote as people who are interested in the future of the built environment, is it a different question in the urban than it is in the rural, right? And I ask this in part because, as I'm sure most people are familiar, while the rates of urbanization across Africa have generally been somewhat lower than they are in other parts of the world, the expectation is that now that rate is accelerating in Africa too, is primarily going to be an urban populace within the next few years. So do we think about these kinds of questions differently in rural and urban spaces?
I think this is a very immediate answer. I haven't had a lot of time to think about it. I think it requires deep reflection. But for me, I don't think there is a difference in approach. I think that my own city, as you said, is exceptionally rich and very urban and very cosmopolitan. But also, I think that there is a lot about the city and about the people who migrate into the city from rural areas that is also very rich and interesting. I think maybe to think about both contexts as a little bit mutated. And also, I think if I think of the future of these contexts, I think, or I hope that they will be more hybrid and more mutated in a way than they are now. But I think, I mean, of course, again, if we talk about developmental challenges, so to speak, then of course there would be a difference in approach because of infrastructures and so on. But I think in terms of listening, that for me the approach would be similar, and I think that to think of them in binaries is also maybe there's how do I say that framing might be problematic as well, because in so many urban contexts that I'm working in, there are things that people would consider to be rural in terms of the way that systems and practices work, or in terms of how people bring with them certain ways of life and ways of being, which I think could really enrich how we look at urban conditions if we were to look at them deeply.
I think it's a really interesting question, Danny, and it's something that I've been trying to thinking about over the kind of years, particularly with the work that I do in Rwanda, and inquire, looking at architecture in terms of its the kind of the development architecture that's happening, and kind of in relation to societies that are kind of have a land dependency. Okay. And I think kind of one of the problems is that, and Sumayya touched upon it, is thinking about it in binary terms, how the urban is always thought of as a kind of like, accumulation of people and buildings, and it has a different relationship with kind of nature. And that is a very kind of like Western idea of thinking about the urban, whereas like, for example, even in Monrovia, just on the outskirts, there's a huge kind of like network of mangroves, and kind of people do have some sort of, there's a much more kind of, it's called a socio-natural relationship with it. It's not kind of thought of in a kind of binary terms, and particularly more so as you probably get into the rural areas, that exchange with the kind of natural environment or the landscape becomes much more significant and kind of meaningful or intensified. I think it's always kind of going to have meaning in other ways. When I say that, I'm talking about in terms of like livelihoods, informal incomes, and economies. And so I think that the understanding kind of the relationship between the built and the landscape and the natural world, which is the kind of almost always thought of in this kind of dualist binary terms, is like between the inside and the outside, the architectural and the landscape, is part of the challenge that we have to face. And that's one thing that let's say there's a kind of we need to kind of like dismantle in terms of Western knowledge. But then there's like the understanding of like these kind of non-Western kind of conceptions of the landscape that operate that aren't entirely economic, and like kind of what we experience like through the idea of the beast, and whether the beast is real or not is not really important or whatever, but the fact that is a possible sort of other cultural kind of relationship with the landscape. And I think that's the other level, the other question on top of that, I suppose, because that, the kind of the production of nature in the colonies was part of the one part of the project. It was about kind of the accumulation of resources, natural resources. It was always in economic terms, but when it means something else in terms of subsistence livelihoods, or simply that there is something out there that is unknown, but it's not economic. That, I think, is the other thing that architects need to kind of engage with. And for one, let's say schools in the Western world are going to have difficulty with that. Because you have to be in these places and have to have kind of deep engagement and embeddedness with these in these places, but also begin to engage with other forms of knowledge through whether it's sociology or anthropology or political ecology. But so. Yeah, but thinking of the urban and the rural is part of the problem in many ways.
Edward, did you want to jump in on that, or should I turn it over to Iker at this point?
I think maybe turn it over to Iker, because I think the question was, yeah.
Great. Okay.
Sounds
Iker,
good. So,
I'll turn it over to you then.
Thank you so much, Danny. So we have one question which is, I think, specifically for Killian and other projects that you've done. So the question is, why do you feel that the architecture specifically is an important layer to the stories of places like Yekepa or Freetown, where you did the Journey with Maps project? So is it the architecture itself? Is it about how architecture fits or doesn't fit in the context? Or is it about a symbol that aids in remembering what to do or what not to do?
Yeah. I suppose like the similarity between the work that I did in Sierra Leone and Freetown and Yekepa is sort of born out of that problem with, the sort of model of practice of having to kind of build things and like chase the building, chase the kind of commission, chase the project. And in the same way, the project in Freetown was interested in sort of understanding how, you know, the current urban challenges that kind of Freetown was facing had sort of been established kind of within its sort of colonial formation, you know, as a kind of crown colony. And sort of the practice then kind of that came out of that was like a kind of way that it engaged with those two, that question of the future and the question of the past, sort of through an action, you know. But the practice isn't necessarily a designing thing or designing an object. It was like kind of working with a group of people. And so, yeah, I mean, the kind of question of context is certainly key. And it is certainly at the foreground of a lot of it, a lot of the work, you know. And that's why there's a sort of interest in this, the kind of tropical modernist kind of trope, because that is held always, that is always kind of presented as the kind of epitome of a kind of contextually aware type of approach to work. And that within itself was like, you know, dealing with the kind of, going back to what we discussed about this idea of what is urban and what is rural, and these sort of tokenistic engagements with culture, but also these kind of Western understandings of what environment means, and environment being the kind of creation of a climate and an interior climate that is, you know, comfortable for a kind of a Westerner, or that is conducive to productivity, you know. So yeah, context is what that is always thought for architects in a very kind of, you know, socio-technical thing, is like an object or a kind of site, and it has kind of multiple perspectives, you know. And so yeah, yes to the context. That's yeah.
Great. We have another question that is related to the institutional background. So doing the research for the movie, but also related to other places in Africa, was there an active role of the UN in the process of setting development strategies?
I don't know if this is exactly getting at the question. I can address this a little bit, I guess. I mean, the earlier, the Cold War moment is, I think it's extremely important to keep that context in mind. Like if we think of a place like Liberia, again, it's not, in the 50s, it's not part of the technical part of the European colonial project, but it's very much a part of the US sphere of influence for the Cold War, right? And so a lot of what passes as development, you know, really until we get up to the end of the 1989, is really part of this kind of geostrategic maneuvering around spheres of influence. You know, the Liberia's rubber trade begins, or, you know, a big part of its early industrial economy is the rubber trade, right? Which is part of the war effort. And then the iron ore extraction is the engine of development, which is connected to, in many ways, the production of the US empire, right? So there's not a specific UN development agenda until, I would say, you know, in the current moment, it becomes very different. I think there is a much more active engagement on the part of the UN as a body in trying to formulate what does a development model look like. But that in some ways is a relatively new development and across much of the continental history.
Great. One of the other questions that we had was related to the couple in Sweden, where they said that they tried, but they failed, and there was kind of like an ambition, I guess, to connect from Langkov to the community, maybe as a legacy or just some type of help. But the movie doesn't really outline what was that. It just mentions that the money, that it required money. Like, do you have a sense from your conversation with them what that strategy was, or was it just when the company was there specifically, or after the company closed?
Do you mean, sorry, what types of strategies were they specifically referring to?
Yeah, just like, was it a sense of what those actions or that involvement that they said it failed? But
yeah, I think just, I mean, Ed, you might want to jump in on this, but they were talking about sort of the idea of making it kind of self-sufficient, okay? And so eventually Yakepa would be self-sufficient. But I don't, I think what they were talking about in terms of self-sufficiency wasn't that, it would be the Liberians like that are benefiting from the ore or like finance. It was like how if they knew eventually, I mean, this was all calculated, geologically calculated, okay, sort of, and it kind of goes back to kind of Sumayya's point about the sort of deep history, like more of a sort of deep history of the ground and the kind of the calculation of how much ore was there would correspond with how long the time would be, let's say, active. Yeah, and they knew when they were going to leave, so there were projects kind of set up for the future, yeah, when they weren't going to be there. For example, things like the production of rice. They transformed a lot of the low-lying ground into paddy fields for the kind of growing of rice, but then there were knock-on consequences from that. I think there was like a spike of malaria, and then they needed a hospital, and there was all these sort of like things that kind of went wrong. But the ore eventually ran out, and they always knew it was going to. But I think probably maybe there was always the intention that it was never going to be forever. They knew that ahead of time. And I just think that once they'd left, and the exit from Ukapa is still something of a mystery to me. It's like, at what point did they leave? I mean, it was like 2 or 3 years prior to the Liberian Civil War, I think when they'd left. And so I think they were talking about that, kind of looking back on it, is that they hadn't done enough, not so much to say that the mine had in itself was an admission of failure, because they don't talk about that. And the conversations are about like, well, how would we do it again? And when they talk about how we do it again, they're like, well, how could we mine again in a more sustainable way? When it's fundamentally extractive. It never works, So, I mean, that's what I understand what they meant. That's what they were making referral to, about the things that they'd set up to make it self-sufficient didn't work.
Great. If you have any final comments about the conversation, now is the time. We're almost reaching out to the 1 hour. So it's I just want to say that it's a fantastic film. I'm really happy that you're telling a story, an important story of a place through these different lenses that you've done it through time, and I think through the research in architecture, what it means, like the built environment, but also a lot of these voices that they provide a much more nuanced perspective of a place that I think is making us think about all these type of relationships, the lack of sometimes tools or ways of looking at a place and the mistakes that we've done. So I think it's just putting this as a 30-minute film for everybody to reflect within their own disciplines, and how much, how we can engage in a much more thoughtful way in multiple contexts, not just in the context of Africa, but really like how do we begin to incorporate many more places. I think is just very, very relevant. So I really appreciate all your perspective. I really appreciate that you're making available the film through Mass Context for this week. And specifically, I want to really thank Sumayya, Killian, Ed, and Danny for this thoughtful conversation. So thanks for everybody to join us today, and hopefully we do more in the future. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, Iker, and thanks, Sumayya, Danny. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was a real honor. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone.